He got promoted off my work, stood in front of the entire company, shook the CEO's hand, and accepted an award for a project I had built from scratch alone at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning while I sat in the third row and clapped. I clapped. And the worst part? Nobody in that room had any idea. Not Glenn. Not HR. Not the executives who were smiling and nodding like they were watching something earned happen in real time. They were watching theft. They just didn't know it yet. My name is Maya. And for 3 years, a coworker named Derek Paulson made a career out of stealing mine. This is how I got it back. But to understand why the ending was so satisfying, you have to understand how it started. And how it started is embarrassingly simple, because the best cons always are. I was 26 when I got hired as a data analyst at a mid-sized logistics firm in Chicago. I was sharp, methodical, the kind of person who stayed 2 hours late not because anyone told me to, but because I genuinely wanted to understand the problem. I wasn't loud about it. I didn't network at happy hour. I just worked. And in a perfect world, that would have been enough. But then there was Derek. Derek Paulson was everything I wasn't: loud, socially fluent, the guy who laughed at the VP's jokes and remembered everyone's kids' names. He wasn't incompetent exactly. He just wasn't half as good as everyone thought he was. And he knew it. Which is exactly why he needed me. It started subtle. The way these things always do. Our manager, Glenn, had asked the team to put together a competitive analysis report. I spent 2 weeks on it: real work, late nights, a methodology I'd spent months quietly developing. I handed it to Derek for a quick look before submission, because that's what teammates do, right? They share things. They trust each other. Glenn read the report. Loved it. Brought it up in the department-wide meeting. Derek, this framework you built here, this is exactly the kind of thinking we need more of. I sat across the table and watched Derek nod slowly, like he was accepting a compliment he had been expecting. He didn't say a word to correct it. He just said, "Thanks, Glenn. I've been thinking about this one for a while." My stomach dropped. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. I told myself I'd clarify it later. I told myself a lot of things people tell themselves when they're not yet ready to accept that they're being used. It happened again 3 months later. A forecasting model I had built from scratch, actual code, actual logic, 60-some hours of my life, showed up in a presentation Derek gave to the senior leadership team. My name was nowhere in the slides. I hadn't even been invited to the meeting. This time I went to Derek directly. Calmly. I told him I needed credit for my work. He looked at me with this patient, almost pitying expression, like I was being difficult, and said, "Maya, we're a team. Nobody's keeping score here." Then he went back to typing. Nobody's keeping score. I replayed that sentence for days. And then something shifted in me. Not anger, I'd had plenty of that. Something quieter, colder, more deliberate. I started keeping score. Not emotionally. Strategically. I opened a private folder on my personal laptop, not the work system, my own machine, and I started documenting everything. Dates. File creation timestamps. Email threads where I had originated the idea. Version histories. Draft documents with my name in the metadata. Screenshots of Teams messages where I had sent Derek materials before any meeting where he later presented them as his own. I wasn't building a complaint. Not yet. I was building a case. And I kept my head down. I kept collaborating with Derek because going quiet would have looked like disengagement, and I wasn't about to let him take that from me too. But now every file I sent him, I also quietly emailed to myself first, a dated, time-stamped breadcrumb trail that nobody knew I was laying. 6 months in, I had 37 documented instances. Here's what most people would have done at this point: gone to HR, gone to Glenn, or posted something vague and furious on LinkedIn and updated their resume. All understandable. None of it would have worked. I did something different. I went to Glenn, but not with a complaint. I came with an idea. I proposed a new internal attribution system. A simple one. Every project deliverable would now include a contributor log in the header: who created it, who revised it, who presented it. I framed it as a professional development tool. Something that would give junior analysts visibility with leadership. Glenn loved it. He implemented it team-wide within the month. Derek had no reason to object. It would have looked petty. So he smiled and said it was a great idea. That was his first mistake. The contributor log started rolling in, and my name was suddenly on everything I had actually built. And Derek's name was on, significantly less than people had assumed. The pattern became quietly visible to anyone who was paying attention. And I made sure the right people were paying attention. I started sending my completed work directly to Glenn, not through Derek, but CCing Derek so there was no friction, no drama. Just a quiet repositioning of who was actually producing what. I started asking questions in meetings. Good questions. The kind that made people realize I understood the work at a level that someone who just typed up notes wouldn't. And then came the annual review cycle. And this is where it gets good. Derek, operating under the assumption that his reputation was iron-plated, submitted a self-evaluation that leaned heavily on 3 flagship projects from the past year. Big wins. Numbers that had impressed the executive team. He listed them prominently, confidently, the way you do when you think nobody's checking. I submitted mine the same week. Quietly. Methodically. And attached to it was a supplemental document, not aggressive, not accusatory, just a clean, professional project history with timestamps, file metadata, email threads, and contributor logs. I titled it Supporting Documentation for Deliverable Attribution. I sent it directly to Glenn and to the HR business partner assigned to our division. I did not send it to Derek. The next 3 weeks were the longest of my life. Then Glenn called me into a one-on-one. He had questions. I had answers. I walked him through the documentation calmly, one item at a time, the way you walk someone through a legal brief, because that's essentially what it was. I wasn't emotional about it. I was factual. Glenn sat there quietly for a long time after I finished. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" he asked. And I said, "Because I needed you to see the pattern, not just an incident." I went home that night and I did not sleep. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Derek had gotten wind that something was happening. Someone in HR had mentioned, offhandedly, that his review was under additional consideration. And Derek, being Derek, decided the best move was to go on the offensive. He went to Glenn's boss, the VP of Operations. He said I had been difficult to work with, that I had been resistant to collaboration, that I had a history of trying to claim individual ownership over what were clearly team efforts. He said it with the same calm confidence he had used to take credit for my work for 3 years straight. And for 48 hours, I had absolutely no idea any of it was happening. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. HR. Could I come in Friday morning? I said yes. And spent the next 18 hours quietly terrified that I had miscalculated. That his charm had won again. That I was about to be managed out for cultural fit issues while Derek walked away spotless. I showed up Friday with a second copy of every document, printed and bound. I didn't need them. Because what Derek hadn't counted on, couldn't have counted on, was that Glenn had already pulled the email logs. The actual server logs, not just my screenshots. Logs that showed, with timestamps down to the minute, who had originated every file, every analysis, every presentation draft. Logs that confirmed everything in my documentation, and then some. And Derek's claim that I was resistant to collaboration? That fell apart fast. Because my emails, professional, responsive, thorough, painted a picture of someone who had been generous to a fault. Someone who had handed off finished work again and again, always with a smile, while her contributions disappeared into someone else's performance review. Derek was placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. He resigned 2 weeks later, before the process completed. He never said goodbye to anyone on the team. I was called back into that conference room one more time. Glenn was there. The VP of Operations was there. And the Chief Data Officer, who had apparently been briefed and had thoughts. They offered me a promotion. A real one, senior analyst, with a team of my own and a salary that finally reflected what I had actually been doing for 3 years. They also apologized. Not with a form letter. The VP looked at me directly and said, "We missed this, and we shouldn't have." I'm sorry. I accepted the promotion. I thanked them. And then I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and quietly deleted the folder I had spent 18 months building. I didn't need it anymore. Here's what I want you to take away from my story, because this isn't a fantasy. This happened. And the reason it worked wasn't because I was lucky or because someone finally decided to be fair. It worked because I never gave them a reason to doubt me. I stayed professional. I stayed visible. And I let the evidence speak so loudly that nobody could talk over it. The goal was never to destroy Derek. The goal was to make the truth impossible to ignore. There's a version of this story where I send one angry email in year 1 and get labeled as difficult. There's a version where I leave quietly, swallow it, and Derek keeps going. I chose the harder, slower, more deliberate path. And it worked, not just because I was right, but because I was ready. If you're sitting somewhere right now watching this and you recognize your own life in what I just described, document everything. Stay professional. Let the pattern speak for itself. And be patient enough to let the right moment find you. Because it will. If this story hit different for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about real people who played the long game and won, subscribe. New video every week. We'll be here.